Anyway, we are in 2 Corinthians, and Pastor Hood last week kicked us off and introduced it. You probably, if you were here, you probably got the sense that the church in Corinth was a problem church. It probably caused the Apostle Paul more headaches and gray hairs than all of his other churches combined. To understand the book of 2 Corinthians, we have to really zero in on what was happening in the church of Corinth and in Corinth itself. So we're going to do just a little bit of background work first, provided by ClickerWorks. All right. So first we have a map. You can see where Corinth is with the red arrow. On the left, there's the boot of Italy, kicking Sicily into the Mediterranean. And on the right, far right, that is where Judea is, Jerusalem, the holy city, and all of that. Notice how Corinth is in the middle of all of this Mediterranean world. And if you would zoom in, you would see that it would be like the perfect port city for shipping and that kind of thing, which meant that there was a lot of money in Corinth. This was an era where for the first time in human history, shipping and transportation was actually doable by sea. And so, Corinth made a ton of money catering to this particular industry. And within the city of Corinth, a whole bunch of industries themselves cropped up catering to shipping and to the sailors. And unfortunately, that meant some pretty dark stuff came up also. And I'll kind of let you use your imagination and figure that out on your own. The church of Corinth itself was predominantly Gentile, as best we can tell. In other words, there weren't a lot of Jewish people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and instead it was mostly people who grew up in what we would call Greco-Roman paganism, so worshiping Zeus and Diana and Artemis and all of them. And this meant that their worldview was profoundly different from the one of the Bible. They would view God or the gods as these chaotic beings who might bless you and might curse you. Or if you needed something from them, you needed to regularly keep up with these sacrifices. You would have to do these things to please them, and then they might give you what you want. In other words, you have to manipulate the gods. It was a profoundly different way of being. They had a lot of sexual liberty, which meant a lot more emotional and spiritual bondage. And the church itself struggled deeply because they didn't catch, it took a long time to catch just who this Jesus person was and what it means to follow him and what he did. And in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is trying to help them along with some certain very serious issues within their new church community. For example, they would have these feasts that would be like communion, but it would be like a larger feast, or so it seems. And the problem is that if you were wealthy, you could go to this whenever you wanted. But if you were poor, you could only go when you got off work, which meant late at night. So the poorer members of the church would show up, and the people who had been there for a while were drunk, and the people who were poor got nothing. And that's a really big problem for a bunch of reasons. There was a guy who was having an affair with his stepmom, and to which Paul had to say, like, you need to kick him out. Not to be mean or anything like that, but you guys are starting to figure out what it means to follow Jesus and follow the one true God, and this will be very confusing for you. You can't do that anymore. Now, we'll come back to that idea of kicking them out in a minute. And there were others who were saying, like, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually raise from the dead, which would be a Greco-Roman pagan idea. Like, the church was a mess. It's kind of like, and you thought your church is a mess. there's always one that is more dysfunctional, and that would be Corinth. Now, something happened, and we don't know what it was, that caused an incredible amount of grief and discord amongst the Corinthian community, potentially and very likely worse than what we would read about in 1 Corinthians. Now, we'll get to that in a second, but to see how Paul is going to set up this problem, we have to look at how he starts this letter off. Letter writing in the ancient world was very formal. There was a set outline you would generally follow. So that it wouldn't be like a text message where you just shoot it off and you get right to the point. Instead, in your greeting, you will start to talk about the things that you will eventually deal with. It's kind of like if I were going to write an email to my parents when I was in college and I was saying like, hey guys, I really appreciate how generous you've always been and thank you for your generosity for sending me to college and you've taught me how to be a generous person. What am I going to do? I'm going to ask for money. So here's how Paul starts this letter. And when Pastor Hood was setting this up, you may have noticed how often this came up. Paul says, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. So also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort. We know that just as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our comfort. Do you think Paul's hinting at something? I don't know. I'm just getting this sense that he has something on his mind. And those are all from the same root, either the verb parakaleo or the noun paraklesis. He is writing to a church community that is in pain. And it turns out there are some very good reasons for this pain. We don't know exactly what they are, but we can read it well enough through the lines. And the church has gone through what amounts to a long series of conflict. And I don't know about you, but I've noticed that within the human experience, conflict tends to happen every once in a while. Have you noticed that? Whether amongst your family, amongst your friends, your community, or at work, really conflict is inevitable. And here's the thing, conflict is not bad. And in fact, conflict is often a good thing because it means that the people care. If nobody cares and everybody is apathetic, you will not have conflict. But you also won't have any meaningful relationship. You're not going to accomplish anything. The problem comes from how we deal with conflict. When emotions start getting raised and tempers start flaring, that's when conflict descends into something destructive. And so we're going to see, as we go through some of these next lines, how Paul is mitigating that, how he is trying to help these people recover from this conflict that took place. And it's an important lesson for all of us. So, Paul begins this section, this chapter 2. He says, "So I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit to you. For if I grieve you, who is left to make me glad but you whom I have grieved?" Now, we don't know exactly what happened. We're kind of sure of the events that happened, but at the very least we know that Paul had to go to Corinth again to sort out something very serious that happened. And his trip was painful. Apparently, everybody left grieved. But if you've noticed here, Paul is expressing the fact that he cares deeply that there was grief involved in his visit. So at the outset, how would conflict change, or how would the tenor of conflict be affected if everybody involved recognized that this is a painful thing? Maybe a little empathy could go a long way. And then he continues, "For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you." So here's the other part of what happened. We don't know exactly, again, what happened, but not only did Paul visit, but he also wrote a letter. Sometimes it's called the letter of tears. It was apparently very harsh because it kind of needed to be. He was dropping some serious truth on this congregation that was tearing themselves apart. We don't have this letter. Boy, would we love to have it. But we don't. And there are theories or ideas of why that might be. My favorite theory is that after reading this letter and working through it and digesting it, the church of Corinth just tore it up and threw it away because it was so painful. But notice that Paul says, I didn't write it to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. How would conflict change? And I realize how painfully hard this would be. This, by the way, is what I call a hypocritical sermon because I'm not very good at most of all of this. Just a heads up. How would conflict change is if when you can tell that emotions are being raised, conflict is coming, to stop for a second and say, I want you to know that I love you, or if that's not appropriate because you're at work, I care about you. I know that you care about what we're doing and what we're talking about. I want that to set the tone for our conflict. How would that change? What then follows? Boy, that'd be tough to do, but that would make a difference. So then Paul writes this. He says, if anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent, not to put it too severely. Anyone find that sentence really confusing? It's because in Greek, I don't think there are actually any nouns in that sentence. Paul is writing in a very weirdly passive way. But he's writing about something and somebody that he knows exactly who did it, and he knows that the church at Corinth who's reading this letter knows exactly who he's talking about, and the guy who did it in the first place knows that he would be talking about him, but he doesn't mention his name or the situation. It would be very easy to say, if anyone has caused grief, Frank, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent, Frank, you know what you did. But he doesn't. He writes passively. This is a skill in conflict, whether it's with a friend, a relative, at work, whatever, that would solve so many problems. And I say this to myself as much as you. To use certain passive language when in conflict, when tempers are raised, could go a long way. Rather than the accusatory, you did this, why did you do this, you hurt me, you made a mistake, you. Rather to say, you know what, this is really bugging me. This is really hard. I think this was a mistake. That passive language, none of this is a surefire way to stop conflict or to make it healthy. But it causes you to take ownership of what you're feeling, and it doesn't raise the defenses as much of the other person. And it gives them a little room to breathe. That rather than feeling like they have to defend themselves, they can say, they can actually own what happened. I would commend this to all of us. So Paul he's speaking very passively, knowing that everybody knows what's going on, because he's trying to soothe the pain of a congregation. And so then he continues, and that should be, I think, verse 6. He says, the punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient. Now, this is where some people actually think this was the guy who was having the affair with his stepmom. I don't know. It fits sort of. It might not. It seems like there was something else. It doesn't matter. But the punishment for this congregation would have been to remove him, saying, you are not welcome to be a part of our community right now. And you might say that's really harsh. And we don't talk a lot about church discipline these days. But the kicker is that church discipline would always be done, and should always be done, with a mind toward restoration. In other words, you are not welcome here because there are certain things we simply do not do. But if you've come to recognize that, you will always have a place back at our table and amongst us. So apparently, this guy who made this huge mistake caused a ton of conflict and grief to the community, we'll call him Frank, has been removed from this community. And now Paul is saying, let him back in. And so he says, now instead, you ought to forgive and comfort him so that he will not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. I urge you, therefore, to reaffirm your love for him. Now imagine this guy caused a ton of strife and chaos and conflict within the community. He is removed. He comes to realize, I made a mistake. There are things in my life that I need to correct. And he has sought the forgiveness of the community. If the community says, no, forget it, we will not forgive you, what happens? Well, things just get worse. He may fall back into whatever it was, and he will not grow, and neither will the community. You get nothing. So Paul is saying, he has sought forgiveness, he is urging Corinth to forgive him, and he is urging them to welcome him back. Which, if you read between the lines, you realize that the church at Corinth is having a hard time doing that. And here is one of the most painful, difficult things about conflict. What if, when the conflict is over and it didn't go well, there are seriously hurt feelings, there's one person who is seeking forgiveness, and say you've forgiven them, but it still hurts. What do you do then? Now, I'm going to admit that just as a person, I deeply struggle with this. It is a flaw in my character. It is hard to let go of that pain. And so now Paul is walking his church, his troubled church, through what it means to welcome this guy back and reestablish relationship. And it leaves this question open of what do you do if it still hurts? Now, first off, I'm not going to have the answers to this. But Paul does give us a model of how we might go about this, because I suspect I'm not alone. First off, he is acknowledging it. You gain nothing by pretending that everything's okay and it doesn't hurt anymore. So step number one, at the very least, is acknowledge this still hurts and I'm having a hard time. And then Paul says this, and it seems out of place. Another reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. Anyone you forgive, I also forgive. Does that seem a little out of place? Like, by the way, I also did this as a test. Well, what he's doing here is he is actually calling his church that he oversees in some way into a deeper level of discipleship and faith. He's not just interested that they welcome this guy back, but he is trying to teach them that sometimes they have to listen to those who are over them, those who serve them as pastor or overseer, because he wants them to grow as followers of Jesus, which gives us another clue into how you deal with the fallout of conflict. And that is, it is that this pain will call you into something deeper. Like that old statement, it can make you bitter or it can make you better. That each time we are in a situation where we have to forgive somebody who may have legitimately hurt us, One, realize there's never an innocent party in conflict, ever. And two, you will have to absorb that pain and deal with it. Inflicting more punishment is not going to make you feel better. But then Paul sets that conversation about forgiveness and pain into a larger story. He says, and what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, and notice the passive language again, and what I have forgiven, if there is anything to forgive, he could have said, Frank, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. So Paul again resists the temptation to just call this guy out, but instead he is saying to the church at Corinth, welcome him back, forgive him, because this is all taking part in this cosmic story of forgiveness in which God forgave you. He sets this in the story of Jesus, where divinity itself takes on human flesh and mortality. And Jesus took on punishment inflicted even though he was completely innocent. The pain that you feel when you are trying to forgive somebody who legitimately hurt you is a fraction of the infinite, insurmountable pain that Jesus experienced as an innocent man taking on the tortured death for others who were profoundly guilty. So at the very least, if you, like me, struggle with this struggle to let go, struggle to forgive, struggle to move beyond the pain and reestablish relationship, realize that this is a part of a much larger story of forgiveness. And actually, as you learn to absorb, learn to work through that pain, God is making you to look more like Jesus. That the same Spirit that drove and empowered Jesus, that animated his every move, is alive and at work in you, healing your heart, making you more whole, teaching you to rely on him, and teaching you to forgive. So the challenge and the hope of this section of 2 Corinthians is that pain is real and it may be hard to forgive and walk away. But you do not do so alone. God is actively at work in your hearts and in your relationships to make you more like Jesus, more cruciform, to call you into a deeper level of faith and discipleship. May you know that forgiveness first comes to you, that your guilt is eradicated on the cross, and may you be empowered to forgive and love just as Jesus, your Lord, does as well. Let's pray.